My name is Alexis Newington. I'm a student at St Paul's School, and I'd like to talk for a few minutes about the Italian Civil War. I only found out about this subject because of a history magazine in school, which I wrote an article for. After having written the article, I decided to do a bit more deeper research into the topic of the Italian Civil War. I found it really interesting, and I found that the study of civil wars in general was very important, and it was an aspect of history that I hadn't really covered to such an extent before. I feel like civil wars as a subject of historical focus is certainly very interesting. It's because of their unique importance in exposing deep ideological divides or political problems within a society. By studying the Italian Civil War, I really found out that these sort of deep wedges that were drawn between different parts of society were very much exposed in Italy. I feel like when you consider World War II in general and then Italy's involvement, a lot of people tend to think more about just fascism, Mussolini, his importance, but people don't really tend to look at the importance of the Italian people themselves on the outcome of the war and then how it shaped Italy after World War II. Because also the war's been viewed quite a lot as a proxy war just for the Allies and Axis, as if it was another battleground for them during the war. But I feel like it's not so simple because of the influence of Italian partisans and Italian people in general on the fighting and the outcome of the war. During this talk, I hope to prove two things, both that the Civil War was very important in shaping Italy's history, both in a political sense and a moral sense of national identity. Then I also want to show you that the war was very complex. It was quite a grim war, and it's often forgotten in Italian history. A lot of people in Italy don't consider it properly as a civil war. It's often referred to as just simply the resistance or the war of liberation, because I feel like a lot of Italian people still don't want to reckon with the fact that it was a war in which many Italians fought on what is now perceived to be the wrong side, the fascists who lost. And it's a war that really deeply drove conflicts between Italian people. I just find it fascinating that there's no sort of clear-cut definition of the war, even 80 years after it ended. The book, just simply called A Civil War, by the historian and the former partisan Claudio Pavone, was released in 1991. But even before this, there was no real historiography about the war and its real importance as a civil conflict between the Italian people. There was a lot of focus put on the resistance against German forces which occupied northern Italy, but the sort of ideological political divide between the Italian people hasn't been mentioned enough up until recently. It was fought between two main belligerents, so the Italian resistance, who were the partisans, and then the RSI, or the Italian Social Republic, who were the fascist forces in the war. The main event that led up to the start of the Civil War was the arrest and deposition of Benito Mussolini on the 25th of July, 1943. It took place after a motion of no confidence was passed against him, because at this point the Allied campaign in Italy had already started with the invasion of Sicily and the bombing of Rome, in which 2,000 people were killed. His bad handling of the war, as well as his sort of friendliness to Nazi Germany, this prevented Italy from being able to sign an armistice with the Allies, which is seen as very necessary at the time. So he was ultimately removed and replaced with Pietro Badoglio. He was seen as someone who was appointed to continue the fascist past in Italy, but also to negotiate an armistice with the Allies. He signed the Armistice of Cassabile on the 8th of September 1943. He feared a possible German response to this. Obviously, signing an armistice with the Allies would be seen very negatively by Nazi Germany. So he fled the country with the king, Victor Emmanuel III, and this left a real power vacuum in the south. His regime was already very unpopular. He imposed martial law. He prevented the formation of any other political parties apart from the fascists, and he often repressed political demonstrations against fascism quite severely. An example of this repression was the massacre of Bari, who just 3 days after Badoglio was appointed, young workers, students as well, were protesting for anti-fascist prisoners to be released outside the fascist party headquarters, and 20 of them were killed. It really demonstrated how the government became very unpopular and martyrs were given to the cause of anti-fascism. So after he left the country, the power of the royal state in the south was basically non-existent, and it allowed for the partisan groups to take power there. Also, after the armistice was signed, there was a very significant German response in the north, so they occupied many northern and central Italian cities, disarming around 600,000 Italian soldiers in the process. The north became the Italian Social Republic, or the RSI, which was led by Mussolini, who was reinstated in September 1943 after he was freed from a prison. He was rescued by Nazi forces. So the north of Italy became this stronghold for fascism, with the Nazis, the Italian fascists. So you can really see there was a geographical divide between the country now, between the fascists in the north and the partisans in the south. The Italian resistance found itself to be very loosely organised. It was made up of a lot of volunteer groups, and until February 1944, there were only 9,000 partisans who were involved in a legitimate armed force. The partisan movement brought together many people from different political affiliations in Italy, so communists, liberals, socialists, monarchists, anarchists. They were organised and brought together by committees of national liberation. In terms of this sort of political organisation, it was done on quite a wide scale. So the communists organised around 50,000 partisans. The Party of Action, which was formed during the Civil War, sort of organised around 40,000, and the Christian Democrats organised around 20,000 partisans. So altogether there were around 200,000 partisans who fought in the war, both men and women, and a lot of them were organised through political parties and committees of national liberation. The fascists had an advantage in terms of their armed forces. They had the National Republican Army on their side, with between 150,000 to 200,000 men. They had paramilitary groups such as Black Brigades. Many Italians left the National Republican Army, who were assigned to coastal defence operations, and they went to go fight in the mountains with partisans, or they simply fled from Mussolini's regime. The partisans tended to engage in more guerrilla warfare style, so they fought in areas of terrain which they knew a lot better than the Nazis, for example. They staged a lot of ambushes and assassinations of major leaders. Their attacks were quite small, but they sort of focused on fighting a war of attrition. This was combated by the fascists by large executions, killings of civilians. As the war progressed, more of these massacres took place. The Ardeatine massacre, in which 335 civilians were kept as hostages and killed after a bombing on Nazi police. So you could really see that even though the partisans were fighting for the liberation of these civilians, their actions would sometimes result in large killings of civilians under Nazi forces. The closing stages of the fighting took place in 1945. They were marked by a lot of general insurrections, which took place in major northern cities. The RSI and the fascists found it quite hard to keep these insurgencies under control. 95% of Italians refused to swear allegiance to the new fascist state there, so it really showed that they didn't have the support of the Italian people to quite a large extent. The Black Brigades were used against these insurrections. About 5,000 of them were deployed. These uprisings started on April the 25th, 1945, under partisan Sandro Pertini, who would be the future president of Italy. They took place in Milan, Genoa, Turin, Bologna. They also saw mass coordinated uprisings in which partisans were even able to gain control before Allied forces came to liberate these cities. Genoa was fully surrendered on the 26th of April, and Turin was liberated by Allied forces on the 1st of May. So the war was essentially over by the end of May 1945, and Mussolini was executed after trying to flee to Switzerland on April the 28th. His body was hung in Milan and shown to the public as a sort of symbolic end to fascism in Italy. But you could see that it's a very gruesome presentation of how fascism was toppled in Italy. With the war being finished, the aftermath of the war brings two very important points to light. One of them being that obviously the war was very significant politically. In June 1946, there was a referendum held for an Italian republic to be formed, which gained around 55% of the vote. So Italy officially became a republic a year after the war ended. The Italian constitution was formed on the 1st of January 1948, which banned the formation of any future fascist parties. So you can see that the history of the country started to become developed on this ideology of complete opposition to fascism. And some of the leading parties who organised partisan forces were very successful in elections following the end of the war. and the Christian Democrats won the first election with 48% of the vote and winning over half of the total seats. The 25th of April became a national holiday, commemorating the day of liberation in which the uprisings in northern Italy started in 1945. So you could really see that there was a very positive spin put on the events of the war and the fact that the resistance had won. However, you can argue that this history became quite tainted by the vengeance killings which took place right after the war. For example, the death penalty was imposed for all fascist leaders and all fascist sympathizers. Around 18,000 of them were killed, many without trial, between 1945 and 1946. The severe retributional violence which took place after the war sort of depicts the resistance as not being this wholly positive force, not a heroic force in Italy. And it mainly just showed that there are two separate ways to look at the end of the war. Overall, there was severe violence and mass killings on both sides throughout the whole war, and a lot of this fighting took place in a very chaotic, unstructured Italian society in which people didn't even know which future of Italy they'd end up fighting for. So there was a lot of confusion in the war. The war was very socially and ideologically complex, and a lot of the violence that took place has been disgraced in Italian history. So I feel like it's definitely a very interesting civil war to have studied, just mainly because of how bloody it was, how important it was in shaping the future of Italy, and also because of the contested history. It's not necessarily a positive outcome in terms of how Italian people were turned against each other in such a negative way, but the way that Italians have chosen to remember the resistance as the great liberating force of Italy has showed me that the war can be seen in many different ways, and that's why the study of civil wars, and this one in particular, is so interesting and important to history in general.